Hello everybody, welcome back to Med School EU. My name is Andy, and today we are going to discuss the second part of the circulatory unit as we are talking about the topic of anatomy and physiology of systems in humans. And this second part of the circulatory unit entails primarily information of anatomy and physiology about the heart. So first, let's discuss blood flow. And in the last video, we discussed starting off with the right atrium, where the blood comes in deoxygenated into the right atrium from inferior and superior vena cavas. So this is VC vena cavas. They're going to come right into the right atrium, and the right atrium is going to contract and push the blood to the right ventricle. Now note that the right and the left atrium contract simultaneously. So at the same time as the deoxygenated blood is going into the right ventricle, the blood from the left atrium is going to be going to the left ventricle. So keep in mind that the right and the left atrium contract at the same time, as well as the ventricles. They're going to contract at the same time. So while the blood, deoxygenated blood, is going into the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle pumps it out to the pulmonary arteries, the left side of the heart, the left atrium, will push the blood to the left ventricle at the same time, and the left ventricle is going to release the oxygenated blood to the aorta and throughout the body. So it's important to note that the atria and the ventricles work in sequence together. First, the atrium are going to contract, while the ventricles are going to be relaxed in diastole. So heart contraction is called systole, and heart relaxation is diastole. So you may see when you're checking your blood pressure, you're going to see two measures. The one that's higher is the systole, because that's the contraction. So obviously blood pressure is going to be higher during the contraction, and during the relaxation phase of the ventricle, you're going to have diastole, and that's why that number is much lower. So what we've got here is we have the blood going from the atria to the ventricles, and it goes through these valves. So these white valves, they are called atrioventricular valves, or you could call them AV valve. So this is an AV valve, and this one is an AV valve, atrioventricular. Now, both of these are a little bit different. So the AV valve in the right atrium is actually called tricuspid valve. So we'll label it here, and the AV valve on the left side of the heart is going to be called the mitral valve. So these are some of the different names that you might hear about these AV valves. However, the general point is to know that they are AV valves, and they're going to pass the blood from the atria to the ventricle, and is going to prevent backflow from the ventricle to the atria, because it would be catastrophic if you would have a leaky valve, because there's a crazy pressure being generated in the ventricles to pump the blood out of the heart and to its body parts, and it would be very detrimental to have any sort of backflow to the atrium, as it is in diastole. It's going to be filling blood. So while one chamber is contracting, or the ventricles are contracting, the atria are relaxed and filling with blood. And while the atria are going to be contracting, the ventricles will be relaxed and filling with blood. Now, when the ventricles are going to be pumping the blood out, heart also has valves for those systems as well, in order to prevent backflow, because again, the blood will be pumped out, but you don't want the blood leaking back into the ventricles. So it's going to be one-way valves, and the valves that are associated with The pulmonary artery is called the pulmonary valve. Pulmonary valve. So these are quite easy to remember because they just go by the name of the artery that they go by. Now this one is the left ventricle will pump the blood out to the aorta. So this is of course called aortic valve. And the middle here, this piece, the middle of the heart that separates the two ventricles is called the septum. This is just an anatomical position that's important to remember. It's going to have a lot of electrical impulses going through the septum, and then these electrical impulses will then separate off into Purkinje fibers. And we're going to talk about the electrical activity of the heart in just a second as well. So as I've mentioned here, through the septum, we are going to have these electrical impulses going along. However, we have to begin with the very start of electrical activity, and that's going to begin right here with this yellow dot right there. And this yellow dot is basically just a clump of electrical impulses or electrical stimuli, and it is called the SA node. SA node. It's called the sinoatrial node, and the SA node is also called the pacemaker of the heart. Pacemaker. It's the pacemaker of the heart because it sets the electrical activity. This is where electrical activity of the heart begins, in the SA node. None of the electrical activity would happen on its own without this SA node, and often at times if the SA node is out of sync, this is when you get pacemakers installed. So the electrical activity of the heart could be controlled to reduce a risk of cardiac disease and all the other diseases associated with the circulatory system. Because typically the SA node is going to beat the heart on its own without any electrical impulse or without any brain activity. So your brain always has to modulate this SA node based on the physical activity of the body. For example, if you are under a peaceful, relaxed state, the brain must always input parasympathetic stimuli onto the SA node, because SA node is going to beat typically 100 beats per minute. Meaning that 100 beats per minute is a little bit much for our resting state. Typically when you rest, the heart beats about 60 to 70 beats per minute. And why is that? Because our brain automatically, remember the brainstem, is going to automatically impose parasympathetic stimuli. And remember, sympathetic stimuli is the fight or flight response, where you want more heart rate, bigger heart rate, and bigger cardiac output. But when you're resting, you would have the parasympathetic response or parasympathetic stimuli, which is going to promote digest and rest, so to speak. And for that, you don't need your heart to be racing. So you're going to have parasympathetic input all the time while you're resting to keep it down, because the regular heartbeat without any stimuli from the brain is going to be 100 beats per minute. So if you were to remove the heart from a body, from a living body, and you remove a living healthy heart, it's going to start beating faster because the SA node provides 100 beats per minute on average. So therefore our bodies have to regulate it. Now, however, if we are in a fight or flight response, so under stress, or you're doing any strenuous physical exercise, the heart rate is going to increase above this 100. So first, we're going to remove parasympathetic input, and we are going to generate sympathetic input onto the SA nodes. Sympathetic. And the sympathetic is going to increase the heart rate to anywhere up to 220 beats per minute. Depending on your age, the max heart rate will be different. The older you are, the lower your max heart rate. Typically, it is 220 minus your age. So if you're 20 years old, then you would do 220 minus 20, and your maximum heart rate is going to be 200 beats per minute, which is quite fast. It's going to produce a great cardiac output. So next, from the SA node, there's going to be two pathways where this electrical stimuli is going to go to. So first, we must understand that both of these pathways occur at the same time. So there's going to be a stimulus traveling over to the left atria, because remember, the right and the left atria are going to contract at the same time simultaneously. So it's going to travel to an area called Bachmann's bundle. It's called Bachmann bundle. And Bachmann's bundle is responsible for stimulating the left atria, and that's the right atria. So the SA node is always located in the right atrium. Now from here, it's also going to pass down the signal to another node called AV node, atrioventricular node. So this is called the AV node. And from this AV node, the atria, the right and the left, are going to contract simultaneously. The signal is going to be passed down to the AV node with a little bit of a delay, because you want to have a full contraction of the atria to have a proper diastole for the filling of the heart. Because if the ventricles are not going to be filled properly, then the heart is simply going to be pumping out its limited potential. So again, when you have a very fast heart rate, it's also not good, because it's going to reduce the cardiac output a little bit, because the ventricles are not being filled completely. It's the same as if you are waiting for a bottle of water to be filled up, but then you're going to be squeezing too early before it's filled up. And then, of course, you're going to get less blood volume pumped out of the heart because it simply wasn't filled yet. So again, the importance of the AV node is that it creates a delay between contraction of the atria and contraction of the ventricle. There's going to be a little pause where the top of the heart's going to contract. It's going to be a tiny little pause of a couple of milliseconds. And once the ventricles are filled, then it's going to create a stimulus. So this AV node, the purpose of it is to slow down the electrical impulse of the heart. Now it's going to travel down further on to another section here. So we're going to label it like that. And this section is called the bundle of His. And bundle of His travels down the septum. So over here, they have already split into the right and the left bundle of His. And they're going to travel over to these parts right here that are called Purkinje fibers. And then these Purkinje fibers are able to stimulate and contract muscles of the ventricles. And both ventricles will contract exactly at the same time. So again, we're going to label this. First is going to be SA node. Next is going to be the AV node that is going to slow down the electrical stimuli. And once the SA node contracts, the signal travels over to Bachmann's bundle, and it's going to stimulate atrial contraction, and they're going to contract at the same time. Next, the stimulus is going to move over to bundle of His, bundle H I'm going to put. Then it's going to branch off to the right and the left branch of bundle of His, and it's finally going to arrive at the Purkinje fibers. And the Purkinje fibers will then stimulate ventricular contraction. So here we're looking at something called ECG, electrocardiogram. An electrocardiogram is basically just a reading of the electrical activity of the heart. So sometimes you may have these probes that will be attached all around the heart in specific points, and then as your heart is beating, it's going to produce this ECG reading. And we are going to depict just the general waves of the ECG and what they represent. So this right here, this little one, this first one is called a P wave. And P wave is responsible for atrial depolarization. So atrial depolarization simply means that the electrical activity of the atria is now going to undergo depolarization. So it's going to be an influx of positive ions into the cells. And when you have these positive ions pass a certain threshold, only then it's going to undergo this electrical stimuli, and only then the atria is, or those cells of the atria that have undergone depolarization will undergo contraction. So before contraction happens, you have a depolarization for any cell, whether this is skeletal muscle or this is cardiac muscle or smooth muscle. You must have depolarization of the membrane potential, and we're going to discuss that when we talk about more about the muscular system and muscular contraction. But just keep in mind for this video is that before contraction occurs, you must have a period of electrical depolarization of those cells. Next, this is called the QRS segment. So this is going to be QRS. And this QRS is responsible for ventricular depolarization. First, the atria is going to depolarize, then ventricles are going to depolarize. However, there's something else that's going on during ventricular depolarization, and it is hidden by in the ECG, it is hidden by the electrical activity of the ventricle. So you wouldn't be able to see it on just a regular ECG. However, what we have going on at the same time is atrial contraction. Atrial contraction. So while the ventricles depolarize, they're not contracting yet. The ventricles are simply going through depolarization first, electrical depolarization. Now, while that's happening, it's going to mask over this atrial contraction. So the atria is actually contracting and pumping the blood through the AV valves into the ventricles. And the ventricles are undergoing depolarization as it's happening during diastole. Now, the part right here after the QRS complex, we've got an ST segment. So S is the last part of the QRS complex, and this is the T wave, which is the final part as this begins all over again. Now, the T wave, and between the T wave and the S part of the QRS complex, there's something called an ST segment. And ST segment is responsible for ventricular repolarization. So ventricular repolarization. So repolarization is after the contraction or after depolarization of the membrane. So first the membrane goes through a huge influx of positive ions, and then it's going to repolarize, meaning it's going to go right back to its negative membrane potential. And it's all going to make a lot more sense when we discuss membrane potential and when we discuss electrical activity of the cell. However, here you just have to note that before contraction occurs, you must have depolarization, and after contraction, you've got repolarization. During the T wave, we also have ventricular repolarization, and during that time, we will also have ventricular contraction occur. And atrial repolarization occurs during ventricular depolarization at the QRS complex, Again, it would produce something like the T wave that's going to be a little bit smaller. However, it is masked over by this gigantic QRS complex, so it's not visible on an ECG. You would need a higher level machine in order to detect the atrial repolarization. So here I'm going to highlight some of the things that simultaneously occur, meaning the diastole and the systole. So diastole is going to be relaxation, systole is the contraction. So before the P wave happens, so that would be the segment here all the way up to about there. So this segment here is when atrial diastole occurs. So I'm going to label this as atrial diastole. So the atria is relaxing. Now, starting off from here, as soon as the P wave happens, or in the middle of the P wave, we are going to have atrial systole that goes all the way up to the middle of the QRS complex. So right here, it's going to be atrial systole. So atria contracts during this time between the P wave and the R part of the QRS complex. Now, during this whole time, the ventricle is in diastole. So all from here all the way down to here, the ventricle, we have ventricular diastole. So this is what occurs at this time. We've got atrial diastole until the middle of the P wave. After the P wave until the R part of the QRS complex, we got atrial systole. However, during that whole time, the ventricle is relaxed. It's not contracted yet. It's in diastole. Now, following this part, the ventricle is going to contract. So let's label it here. It's going to start off from here, from the middle of the QRS complex, and it's going to go all the way down to the end of the T wave. And during this time, the ventricle will contract. So it's going to be ventricular. However, during the ventricular systole, we are going to have atrial diastole. If we are going to go through the entire ECG segment, it begins off with atrial and ventricular diastole. First, the atria is going to contract from the middle of the P wave to the R from the QRS complex. Now, once the atria is done its systolic phase, it's going to enter into diastole until the P wave again. However, if we're looking at the ventricle here, it's going to first start off with diastole, and then once it reaches the QRS complex, it's going to have a contraction. So ventricle systole all the way until the end of the T wave. Now, this is just some basic anatomy of the heart. So the heart layers, what they're made up of, and what they're called. So the innermost layer of the heart is called the endocardium. Now, going more inwards, this muscular layer is called the myocardium. Myocardium, and of course it's made up of the cardiac muscle. Now, this next layer is called the epicardium. And it's something called visceral layer of serous pericardium. Next, we have the pericardial cavity. So this is just a cavity, it's empty space. The next part that's more on the outside of the cavity is called the parietal layer of serous pericardium. So this is also pericardium. And the most outside portion of the heart, the most outside layer, is called fibrous pericardium. So this is all pericardium, these two layers, and the cavity is called pericardial cavity. However, this is called fibrous. So these are just the typical depictions. We've got pericardium on the outside, we got the cavity, then it's epicardium, myocardium, endocardium. So just remembering the order in which it goes in, starting off from the inside, endocardium, endo meaning inside, then myo meaning muscle, then going over to epicardium, the cavity, and pericardium. So there are two heart sounds. They go by lub, dub. So we got lub, which is the first heart sound, S1, and we got dub, which is the second heart sound, lub, dub, lub, dub. And what they represent is the shutting of the valves, specific valves. So first, let's label them here. The lub is responsible for the shutting of the atrioventricular valves, so shutting of the AV valves. So that's the valves that go between the atria and the ventricle, hence the name AV valves. That's going to be the mitral between the left ventricle and the aorta and the left atrium, and the tricuspid valve. So that's going to be the AV valves shutting off. So once they close, you get the sound of lub. And the closing of the AV valves occurs during ventricular systole. So if you could imagine that the ventricle is contracting, it's in systole, you don't want any blood flow or any backflow into the atrium. You want all the blood flowing out of there into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. You don't want the blood flowing back into the atrium, so they're going to shut. As soon as ventricular systole begins, you get the sound of lub, where you have the AV valves, mitral and tricuspid. They're going to be shut. That's where the sound comes from. So if you put a stethoscope onto the heart. Now dub is the second sound, and that's the closing of the aortic and the pulmonary or the pulmonic valves. So we've got aortic and pulmonary valves. It's the shutting of the aortic and pulmonary valves. And of course, this occurs once we have ventricular diastole. So the filling of the ventricle. And it's going to be during atrial systole. So when the AV valves are open, the aortic and the pulmonary valves are going to be closed because the ventricle is going to be filling. And you don't want the ventricle to be filled back with the blood from the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So both of these are going to be shut to prevent backflow from those arteries. And so that the blood in the ventricle could only be filled by the fresh blood from the atria. So this concludes our lecture on circulatory system, part 2. Today we talked a lot about the heart. In our previous lecture we talked all about the circulatory system and all of the blood vessels. So we have completed this unit, and in the next one we are going to discuss the respiratory system.